This is a GCSE Biology presentation looking at plant structures. To get started, you have a number of terminologies along the bottom half of your screen. And all you have to do is to start with list the levels of organization. So there's 5 levels of organization. And then for each of the terms below, match them to the appropriate level of organization. Pause the presentation now, and when you're ready, you can restart and check your answers. Pause now. Well, the 5 levels of organization are: cells combine together to form tissues. Tissues can combine together to form organs. Organs form organ systems, and organ systems are found in an organism. In terms of matching the terminologies, the transport systems, cardiovascular system, and lymphatic system are all examples of organ systems. The organs were the stomach, the leaf, the stem, and the heart. The tissues, connective tissue and muscle tissue, were the obvious ones, but the phloem and the xylem in plants are also examples of tissues. And the cells are the nerve cell, the root hair cell, and the epithelial cell. In this lesson, we're going to identify some plant systems, organs, tissues, and cells. We're going to describe the structure of the leaf, and we're going to look at how organs, tissues, and cells are adapted to the particular functions. In terms of plant organs, there are several plant organs you should be aware of from Key Stage 3, including the flower, the stem, the root, and the leaf. The transport system combines the root, the stem, and the leaves. Remember, the flower is involved in the reproductive system. Organ systems are groups of organs with a particular function, but each organ has its own job within that. And remember, each organ is made up of tissues, and tissues can have their own functions, but they all carry out a common job. In terms of the leaf is an organ. It's adapted for photosynthesis. It has a large surface area to maximize the area which light is absorbed. It is thin and flat in shape for the most part, and that's to minimize the diffusion pathway. It's also got a branched network of vascular tissues, which is for transport of substances. And there are air spaces in the spongy mesophyll layer inside the leaf, and we'll look inside the leaf in a second, but that's to increase the rate of diffusion of gases. You may be asked in the exam to identify how a leaf is adapted for photosynthesis, and you should make reference to these statements. In terms of the structure of the leaf, the diagram in front of you gives you an overview of what it should look like. If you got a leaf and you put it down so you're looking along the flat edge of the leaf and you sliced across and look down that flat edge. You have several layers inside a leaf. Remember, each of these layers represents a tissue. So we have the epidermis, can be referred to as the upper epidermis because there is an epidermis on the lower half of the leaf, but epidermis is fine. And the epidermis consists of that yellow line along the top, which is the cuticle, which is a waxy layer that is waterproof and prevents water loss. And then the epithelial cells, which are the green cells just below the orange line. They combine together to make the upper epidermis. The next layer below that is called the palisade mesophyll. And as you can see, they have large numbers of chloroplasts. The reason they have large numbers of chloroplasts is to maximize the amount of sunlight they can absorb. And as a consequence, we can maximize the rate of photosynthesis. The spongy mesophyll is where we're talking about air spaces and rate of diffusion. And the spongy mesophyll, you can see there are gaps in between the cells. And the bottom layer is called the epidermis. Now, if we move to the right-hand side, we can see there's a thing called a vascular bundle. And we'll look a bit more at a vascular bundle later on. But a vascular bundle is essentially xylem vessels and phloem vessels. And again, we'll look at xylem and phloem in a little more detail. At the very bottom, we have what are called guard cells. Guard cells are the cells found right next to a small circular opening in the bottom of a leaf. that small circular opening is known as a stomata, and the cell on either side of that circle opening, which is the stomata, are called guard cells. You need to be able to label that diagram. You need to know how to spell those words. You need to be able to identify the tissues on the left-hand side, and you need to be able to identify all the different names inside the vascular bundle in terms of xylem and phloem. We'll also look at how stomata work. Before we go any further, there are a number of plant tissues, and you will be asked in the exam how those tissues are adapted to the particular functions. What you have to do now is match the left-hand side with the right-hand side. So the statements don't necessarily line up. You've got to draw lines between them. Whenever you're ready, you can restart the presentation and check your answers, but pause now and try your best. And let's have a look through the answers. Well, the epidermis tissue is that upper layer, and it's that lower layer inside the leaf, and it's the boundary between the actual plant organ and the outside environment. Remember, on the top of that epidermis or epidermal layer, we have that waxy cuticle as well as part of it. And it's all about preventing water loss. The palisade mesophyll, well, that is the layer that had all of the chloroplasts tightly packed together cells. They're all in big long columns to maximize the absorption of light, and that's for maximize the rate of photosynthesis. The spongy mesophyll, well, they're made up of cells that are loosely packed together and have got a thin layer of water around them, and again, they're designed to maximize the rate of gas diffusion. In terms of the xylem is made up of a series of cells where the ends are removed and form a hollow tube. We also have a substance called lignin, and lignin is what we find around the outside of the xylem, which forms a much stronger frame, which is why the xylem can also be involved in support of the plant stem. The phloem is a set of living cells. Again, we'll go into it in more detail in a little bit, but we have these things called sieve plates as we move down, and we also have companion cells. And companion cells are necessary because the phloem cells are alive, but they don't actually have their own mitochondria and organelles. They rely on the companion cells to supply them with things like energy. And the last thing we'll talk about is what's called a meristem tissue. And the meristem tissue refers to the very, very tip of a root or the very tip of the shoot, and it contains stem cells that are continually dividing by mitosis for plant growth, and it's the very tips of those two particular parts of the plant that continue to grow. You need to memorize all the things on the left, and unfortunately, folks, you've got to memorize the things on the right as well till you can match them up and be able to do them without looking at the words. You should be able to give the written definitions on the right hand side without any line matching it. We're going to look a little more detail at the stomata. Sometimes referred to as a stoma. Either term is fine. Stomata or stoma will be accepted in the exam. But the function of the stomata and the guard cells on either side of it is to control gas exchange and loss of water through a plant. We'll look in more detail in another presentation about the process of transpiration, which is how water moves through a plant. If you want to, by all means, go and find that and have a look through that one. But what we have is two conditions or two environments. If we have an environment where there is a large amount of water, the vacuoles inside the guard cells are filled. If they are filled, the cell membrane is pushed up against the cell wall, and we say that the guard cells are turgid. When that happens, the hole in the middle, which is the stomata, is as open as wide as it can be. That means we have the maximum rate of gas exchange, but we also have the maximum rate of water loss out of the stomata. In terms of the other environmental condition is when we have limited water. It doesn't have to be no water, just limited water. If we have limited water, then the vacuoles are not anywhere near as filled, and you can see they're quite empty. As a consequence, we have what we call flaccid cells. And flaccid cells, or when the vacuole is so empty the cell membrane has moved completely away from the cell wall. It's no longer touching the cell wall. And as a consequence, the stomata has closed up. The gap between the guard cells is minimal and can even go to zero, so that there is no gas exchange, no gas can get in or out, and we also have no water loss out as well. And depending on whether the plant is in an excess of water, so there's lots of water about, we can have turgid guard cells and the stomata fully open. If there's an extreme shortage of water, then we'd have flaccid guard cells and the stomata is closed. There is a problem, of course, with the stomata being closed, that while no water can get out, no carbon dioxide can get in, and carbon dioxide is a key requirement for the process of photosynthesis. Another type of cell you need to be aware of is a root hair cell. Remember, root hair cells are little cells found around a root. They're not the actual root themselves. So where you find those little fine hairs or fibers coming off a root, we talk about root hair cells. Their function is twofold. First one is the uptake of water by osmosis, and the second one is the uptake of mineral ions by active transport. Now, don't worry if you're not too clear on what osmosis and active transport are. There are other presentations on those. Please do go and check them out if you need to. To increase the rate at which exchange occurs, so it'll be either water or mineral ions, the root hair cell has those little projections to maximize the rate of exchange by increasing the surface area. What you also have is large numbers of mitochondria, and remember, mitochondria is the location where respiration occurs, and respiration is a chemical process in which carbon dioxide is produced, water is produced, and it requires glucose and oxygen. So it is the opposite process to photosynthesis. But in that process of respiration, when glucose and oxygen are chemically reacted, energy is released. And that energy that gets released through respiration is used for the active transport of mineral ions into the root hair cells. Now, just to finish off, what I'd like you to do is a task called Help a Friend. What you have to imagine is one of your friends was absent for the lesson presentation we've just gone through. You've both arrived at your next lesson, and as you go in the door, teacher says, right, we're going to do a quiz all about what we did last lesson, and you've only got 10 minutes to tell your friend what the lesson was all about and give them as much information as they can so they can score as high as you can on the test. So what information, what keywords, what terminologies must they know in order to try and get through the quiz?